Today's episode is episode 197 of Unconventional Humans podcast. Today's episode is called The Outsider. Today I'm going to talk about this term, outsider. I think Albert Camus, French writer, French philosopher, he wrote a book called The Outsider. I think I read that book as part of my degree in French, L'étranger. The Foreigner is the direct translation, but it can be translated as The Outsider, which is probably more accurate in English. I can remember when I was reading that, I don't think I was really tuned into what the book was about. I can't even remember what my thoughts on the book were at the time, to be honest, but I know that if I read that book again now, my perspective on it would be a lot different because it's something I can relate aspects of it to. So the story is different to my life, but there's parts of that book that I can relate to, and so I'm going to just talk about The Outsider today in this episode, just to, to bring some different perspectives to this word, this feeling, because it's something that I struggle with, and oftentimes when you struggle with things, it helps to put some sort of words to it and some sort of voice to what you're struggling with. So the outsider, it's very hard to pin down. So in order to have an outsider, there has to be insiders. That's the dichotomy here. So that's one thing to keep in mind, I guess, whenever you are within a group of people, that in order to feel like an insider, somebody else possibly needs to feel like an outsider. Just the way things are, unfortunately. But I want to help myself to challenge this negative feeling about being an outsider just by talking around it today, to actually point out what are the benefits to being an outsider that aren't actually very obvious until you think about it. Because I got to a stage where this feeling wasn't going away. I actually realized the more I was being creative with the podcast, with my writing, the more this feeling consumed me. That was the paradox of this, that on the one hand I was expressing myself, or I am expressing myself, and I feel more free for doing that. But on the other side, I also feel like this feeling of being an outsider is getting bigger. And it's something that over the last few months I've had to deal with a bit more and face it on, because it wasn't going anywhere, just that feeling I had. And what helped me was to question, like, what are some of the benefits to being an outsider? What do I do today that is beneficial to me, that came from the fact that I was willing to feel like an outsider? Because the thing is, when I was growing up, I didn't feel like an outsider, but that isn't to say that I wasn't. I feel like when I was growing up, I, like a lot of people, spent a lot of time trying to fit in, and there were certain things that I could easily fit in with because they were actual interests of mine. But there was kind of behaviors, habits I built up over the years to help me to fit in, but that were actually not in alignment with who I was as a person. So that's what you're dealing with, that you mightn't actually feel like an outsider growing up, but that's not to say that you weren't an outsider deep down. That's from my own experience. The other thing to keep in mind, I guess, as somebody who has traveled, lived abroad, I've heard of the concept of reverse culture shock. So people talk about culture shock when you go to a new country, different way of living, different way of being, different way of operating. I guess especially when you go to another country, there's a different language, you're actually learning the language there. There can be a culture shock to the system, but there can also be a reverse culture shock. Say if you spend a year abroad, or even 6 months, even 3 months, I guess it depends on the person. You could come home and you could actually experience the opposite. You could feel like it's a culture shock to the system coming home again. I guess because of what you've been exposed to in the other country, even at an unconscious level, you've changed in some way. I remember the first time I went to France, I felt like I didn't change at all. But looking back on it, I of course I changed. I changed at more of a unconscious level. I just kind of told myself I didn't change, and I behaved pretty much the same as I would always behave. But there was definitely stuff that were opening my mind at that time that I can see now, and I can see a little bit in hindsight now. But the outsider feeling, so that's the outsider feeling can crop up there when you've got the culture shock. You feel like the outsider. You don't feel like you fit in. You're like some of the ways of being and operating feel very foreign to you, and it can give you that feeling of being an outsider. So taking this away from travel, you might have never traveled outside your country or your town. You can still feel like an outsider in your town. And I think the more you're honest with yourself and express how you truly feel and think, the greater chances you have of experiencing this feeling of being an outsider. So I'll bring it to the positives of being an outsider. So the positives of being an outsider is that your creative expression, your ability to self-express and be creative with your words increases, which means that when you actually do things that are creative, there's a bit more of a flow to it because you're not stifling yourself. I found when I was more of a tendency to not embrace my creative side, not be willing to feel like an outsider, I felt more stifled when it came to actually verbalizing things, either writing, podcasting. You might notice at the very start, if you listen to the first few episodes, I've gradually gotten more comfortable with this. So I've been able to express myself better. My confidence has increased. But also this feeling of being an outsider has increased as that has increased. And what's helped me now is to actually see that there are two sides of the same coin. So to be somebody who can actually have input to a conversation, input on something on life that's actually in some way valuable, then that's going to have to come from somebody who's outside the normal ways of thinking in that scenario. So that's what the outsider brings to the table. The reason they feel like an outsider is because in certain aspects of things, they're thinking very differently to the average person in society, in their town, in their country. And so that can feel isolating, but that's also what is needed for somebody to give new thoughts, new perspectives to a conversation. The other thing that helps me then is when I think about artists or when I think about people at the top of their field in sport or different areas of life, people that I look up to. I always kind of looked at them naively when I wasn't doing my own thing. I kind of felt I could only see the benefits to their life, but I didn't see, because I can't get a glimpse at their inner world. I don't know what they're feeling day to day. At least by following my path here, I've grown to understand that if somebody's at an elite level, they have to be thinking and doing things differently to other people. If that wasn't the case, then they wouldn't be at a higher level than other people. So I guess what I'm realizing is that they would have to in some way feel like an outsider on the opposite side of the coin. That they're at this high level because they're thinking at a different level. But because they're thinking at a different level, they'll also feel like an outsider. So I guess that depends on the person, because possibly if you're at a position where you've got success in the area where you feel like an outsider, it might not feel so bad because people look up to you, they respect you in that area. So I guess it's more challenging it could be more challenging when you're in an area where you're thinking outside the box, sharing your perspectives, but you don't have objectively a certain level of respect, of success. I guess that would earn you that respect. So that might lead to more intense feelings of being an outsider when you haven't got that level of success. But I guess this podcast is just to talk around this. At the end of the day, we're dealing with a feeling. And I think when you talk about it, it helps to release the grasp that the monster has on you when you start actually exposing what the monster is in some way through your words. I guess that's the whole point of this episode. I feel like at least acknowledging that this is a feeling that I'm carrying around with me, then verbalizing it, it helps me to realize that the issue is in my relationship to this feeling, and it's a feeling. It's not an objective truth. It's my relationship with that feeling, and I just think it helps to acknowledge it, because when I wasn't acknowledging it, I think I was trying to have my cake and eat it. So I wanted all the benefits to being creative, being able to express myself better, being able to think about things, and really enjoy doing that. Really enjoy the process of understanding my world better, who I am better day to day. I wanted my cake and I wanted to have my cake and eat it. So I wanted all the benefits. But when it came to the negative aspects of it, I didn't want it. I didn't want to feel like an outsider at the same time as doing this, even though they go hand in hand. You can't separate the two. Because if I'm trying to be an insider, then I have to sacrifice my ability to think for myself. It's either or. As a programmer, it's if this, then that. It's if else statements. It's logical. Like, it's one way or the other. You can't have both. And I guess anyway, this feeling can bring a bit of depth to your work too, because it's a struggle feeling like this day to day. And I think just acknowledging it helps me to realize that the issue is with my relationship to this feeling rather than the people I'm with and where I feel this feeling coming up. Because oftentimes I would feel this feeling coming up if I'm among a few people and the conversation is around things that are not really of interest to me. And if I've got no input in that conversation, that feeling can start coming up in me where I feel like I'm kind of like an alien here, where I'm not that interested in what's being said here. And I can easily feel like I'm the issue here. I'm this alien here who can't even fake an interest in what's being talked about. So it's a process. It's not easy. And I find that talking to people about this, for me in my life, helps. There's no fixed answer here other than acknowledging how I'm feeling and acknowledging how I want to feel as well. And like I'm saying, I guess it brings a little bit more depth to what you're talking about, because it's a struggle living like that too when you're feeling that way. But it's part of the challenge. It's part of the growth. That's why I'm talking about it today, sharing it, because if you're on your path to thinking more and more for yourself, being more confident in yourself, then I would bet you're facing this feeling, the outsider feeling. So the other thing with the outsider feeling that I think about is just the balance being struck between solitude and isolation. So I know that I need moments of solitude. I find it too draining to be around people all the time. So I need moments where I am by myself, or at least with just one other person who gets me. So I've realized over time that it's important for me to be around people who get me, and I don't so much get that really from big social gatherings. So I limit that as much as possible for me. That's what I've kind of grown to learn about me, that I don't do well in those settings. Some people do. Some people love that. They get energy from that. But I don't. That's kind of what I'm learning here. But then it's the fine balance between solitude, moments of solitude, and isolation. So that's something to keep in mind. That's something I keep in mind as I move forward. Sometimes I can possibly like solitude a bit too much. But then it's not sacrificing yourself either. Like, really get to know the people around you. Are they accepting of who you are, or are they trying to contort you into a version of somebody you're not, just so they can be more comfortable So those things are as well are important to keep in mind with this. And then I'll just talk about the insider feeling, just to show that this isn't all sunshine and rainbows and unicorns either, being an insider in the group, because I've experienced that too, where I thought I was an insider in groups that I've been, or I felt it too, I guess. Yeah, I guess I felt it to an extent too. But so you're talking about the opposite. So you get a sense of your being accepted and your belonging. But the thing is, you know deep down that acceptance is conditional, because as long as you act and behave the way that is acceptable in that inner group, you're fine. But once you start acting, see, it starts with thought. So when you start thinking, which will lead to your actions and behaviors later on down the line, when they start changing, then you're starting to be on shaky ground in relation to your sense of belonging in the group, because deep down you knew that it was conditional acceptance in that group. So in order for you to keep that sense, that feeling of being an insider, you have to give up your ability to think for yourself, get to know who you are, get to know what you're really interested in, what you care about, and also give the fear of rejection even more weight in your mind than it deserves. They're all the negatives to being on, to having that insider feeling, if it's not a genuine group where people are being accepted for who they are. So it's the opposite of being an outsider. So you get the facade of fitting in, and you don't have to deal with this outsider feeling, which is possibly one of the more difficult feelings to feel in life, because it is linked to that feeling of rejection. As an outsider, it feels like you've been excommunicated from a group, you've been rejected from a group. So it's that feeling, and that's how it's so hard to verbalize, because physically, on the physical level, you're around people, you're around your family, you're around different people, and it doesn't look like you don't fit in. But that mightn't be the reality of how you feel a lot of the time. So that's how it's tricky to describe this. And I've noticed that it by just adjusting the way I think about things and just to fit in, it helped me to avoid the outsider feeling, which is very unsettling, I find, until you start to come to terms with it a little bit, I guess. But you just feel more of a shell of yourself. You're not really even trying to be yourself, trying to understand who you are, what you want, who you're interested in talking to. So that's the sacrifice there. So it's pick your poison, and I'm pretty happy with the path that I'm continuing to go down. I feel at this stage, I've gone too far down it to turn around at this stage, and I'm not regretting it at all, because even though there are these challenging feelings, at least I actually feel like these are genuine feelings though. As an insider, there's no way I'd be able to describe what I'm describing today. So I'd much be able, I prefer to be able to understand these things a bit better and just keep moving forward, and maybe help some people along the way with similar struggles. But that's it. That's what I want to talk about today. The outsider. Hope that's been of use, been of value. If you like today's episode, if you could give a rating and review to the podcast wherever you're listening to it to, it helps the podcast to grow. And that's it. Thanks again for listening, and I will speak to you on the next episode.